Welcoming everyone. Hey everyone, thanks for coming to the first session of our academic writing series. This is hosted by the Violence Prevention Institute, the Center for Excellence in Maternal and Child Health, and the Mary Amelia Center. We're super excited to have Dr. Andrea DeVera today to help us break down how to actually read a paper and how to categorize all the papers that we do read into one section. I think we're going to go over EndNote a little bit as well. So really excited to have her talk today. This will be recorded and we'll be sure to send this out to you for further reference. But make sure to take notes, ask any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll also leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andrea.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. It's really great to be here. Like Hope mentioned, my name is Andrea. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Violence Prevention Institute and the Center of Excellence Maternal and Child Health. I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen, and we'll get right into it. There we go. Everyone can see that, I believe. So just a little bit of grounding of what this workshop will include. I'm really going to try to focus on helping us develop our abilities to read and comprehend public health research papers so that we can strengthen our capacity to evaluate papers and critical existing research literature. We're going to start with a check-in, and then we'll have something of a mini lecture that will go over these topics. Move some stuff around. There we go. So before we get into a mini lecture, though, I always like to try to actually engage with people, which might be a little weird for a workshop on reading. So I want everyone to take a little bit of time to go to this QR code, which I'll put in the chat in just a second. You could also scan that with your phone if that's easier. But I want you to go to this poll everywhere, and I want you to finish the sentence, reading papers is, and just use 6 words or less to finish the sentence. Write anything you want. It's going to be entirely anonymous. I will jump here, and soon as we get some more responses in, I'll share the results. And I like to do this because I think it's a easy way to start to demystify the conversation a little bit about reading research papers. So I see we have 5, but we have 19 participants in the room. So I'm going to wait till we get at least about 10. Ooh, yay. Okay. So I'll go ahead and just start to share the responses. Okay. Interesting, but can take a long time. A process. Time consuming. Sometimes tedious. Tedious and overwhelming. Time consuming and overwhelming. Mentally challenging. So I'm seeing a lot of overwhelming, challenging, time consuming, but it is also fun. I love that someone put that in too. It helps you get the main idea, sometimes confusing. So I think they get the idea. It's not always accessible too. And I feel like there's a lot that comes with reading, which is why I like to sometimes start with this activity. Reading papers can be challenging. It can be overwhelming. It can be intimidating. It is also important and fun at times. So why do we want to read papers in public health? Well, we know generally the purpose of research is to create and generalize knowledge. The purpose of reading research is to digest that knowledge for some kind of real world application, including advancing the science and moving it forward. So whether we find it kind of challenging or not, or pain or not, reading is definitely one of the most important things we'll be doing as public health professionals, and scholars broadly. Um, so I'm going to go over a couple of different types of papers. And we'll just kind of, like I said, demystify some of these main concepts. Um, the first one is theoretical or conceptual papers. Second one being empirical papers, and we'll kind of gloss over a little bit of each of these types. Each type of paper conveys different information, including how that information is analyzed or organized. And so you'll want to read different papers depending on what kind of information you're looking for. So starting with theoretical and conceptual papers, I put a little screen grab of one that you might see in something like the American Journal of Public Health. Um, we know that it's a theoretical and conceptual paper because it's based on some sort of idea, perspective, or criticism. They're really trying to propose some sort of new theory, but there's generally no data. Data being the qualitative, the quantitative, the numbers, the statistics. We'll get into that a little bit more. Um, but in theoretical and conceptual papers, there's not necessarily data, but there is some critical review or analysis of ideas, and such that you're offering some new and important idea. Empirical papers are like the screen grab of this one. So empirical essentially means that it's based on some sort of systematically collected data. Um, and the purpose is to analyze and describe that data in some sort of way that you're answering a very specific or important question. That question should address a critical gap in the knowledge system. So something we don't know very much right now about. You are then analyzing and collecting data to answer that question. The paper is to try to then disseminate that information, and the type of data can sometimes determine the type of paper. So I'll kind of walk through that a little bit as well. Everyone here is probably pretty familiar with the concepts of quantitative and qualitative data, but I'll go over them a little bit just to make sure we're all grounded in the same understanding. So quantitative data usually ask questions about what might be happening. This is essentially numeric-based data. So if you had a survey with a closed-ended response saying, how much do you agree with the following sentence? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. That would be a way of numerically coding those responses and then analyzing that. Census data is also another great example of numeric-based data. Let's say you're looking at numbers of population and different demographics within that population. Crime statistics are another one. Again, we're thinking of numeric-based data. Um, People call quantitative more objective. Doesn't necessarily mean it is objective, but there's only so many ways you can interpret numbers correctly. If there's only two different categories of something that you're looking at in a sample, then there's just two categories. Importantly, that doesn't mean quantitative data is completely objective, because ultimately we're still creating it and the research is guiding that creation of that data. So there's a lot we could unpack there if we have discussion or questions at the end of the presentation. But like I mentioned, because it's numeric based, you need to use statistical analysis to try to make sense of it. Qualitative data is asking more questions about how or why something is happening. This is what you would consider language-based or visual data. So that can look like interviews and focus groups, open-ended questions on surveys. So if I said, tell me about how life is going, you would have an open-ended question. Instead of saying, is life good or bad? And they can only choose good or bad as the response. There's just an open-ended that they can write in anything they want. Photos are another really interesting way to collect qualitative data and something you can analyze qualitatively or not. Importantly, qualitative is very subjective. So whereas there's only certain ways you can interpret a number, there's a more variety of ways you can interpret something like a photo or a sentence or a conversation. So this means you have to use a different kind of analysis, which is generally qualitative analysis. And there's a whole bunch of different theories and methodologies on doing that. Really quickly, there's other kinds of data-based papers as well. Mixed methods is when you're incorporating both quantitative and qualitative data. So that might look like a more exploratory or explanatory design where you either start with the quantitative and then add a qualitative piece, or you start with a qualitative piece and then add a quantitative piece to try to explain something. There's some interesting examples of mixed methods research. Um, Something that I've done a little bit on, especially looking at community violence, is looking at how people describe perceptions of their neighborhood and then comparing the perceptions of their neighborhood to violent crime statistics. That would be comparing both the qualitative and the quantitative. A systematic review is a very specific kind of data where the data you're analyzing is already published papers. Um, these are very important types of studies because they help you identify gaps or trends in research literature. And there's different types. There's meta-analyses, which are more quantitative, systematic reviews that try to look at an entire body of literature. There's qualitative synthesis, where if you're doing something, but the data is more qualitative. Um, and so you'll definitely come across these papers as well as you're doing your own literature reviews and research. I want to go a little bit more into what you will see in an empirical research paper. Again, what I hope is the biggest takeaway for this workshop is just looking at, demystifying these main concepts so that when you're reading, you're able to just focus on digesting the information rather than trying to understand the organization of it. So we're going to go through each of these different sections with this example paper that I brought up earlier. That was a empirical paper looking at the spatial consequences of abortion restriction in Texas. So this is what the abstract would look like. Abstracts are just essentially short summaries of the paper. They might be structured. So this one is structured because it very clearly has headers for the objectives, the methods, the results. Sometimes it's not structured where it's just one big paragraph. They're generally not too long. It depends on the journal that you're looking at. But I would say usually less than 300 words. And they set you up for the introduction. So the important thing is the abstract just gives you the bite-sized takeaway, what the whole study's doing. The introduction is now the part that is going to start to introduce very broadly the research problem or question that the study is trying to address. It tries to identify some sort of gap in the current state of the literature or knowledge system as well. So here in this little snippet that I cut out from the paper, they're setting up the political context of the Dobbs decision that overturned the constitutional right to abortion access. So they're identifying a very particular problem that the research is seeking to address. The literature review is a continuation that essentially tells you what is known and what is not known about the research problem or question. It also importantly provides context on the issue, such as where they're talking about in this section about um, the lack of access to abortion facilities after this decision, um, in that it's leaving women without health care essentially. Um, the literature review may not actually have a header, like in the abstract, there's a header for how you see abstract. There is usually one for introduction, but it's cut off here. Literature review may not actually have a header. It might just seem like it's a bigger part of the introduction. Um, Methods have their own special header and section because this is where you clearly start to describe the procedure of your research study, and the current study that's being used to address that research question that you just introduced. So the method should give you important information about the sample. So in human subjects research, and in research broadly, research has a sample of people that are participating in it. Or if you were looking at um, a systematic review, the sample might include all the papers that were analyzed in that systematic review. It's essentially who's in the study and the focus of that research. You should also have some important demographic information on that sample. So, for example, in this method section, they're talking about using the category of women of reproductive age. So it says 15 to 49 years. They also have some information about how they're looking at different social and demographic factors, such as standardizing neighborhoods by socioeconomic position, concentrated disadvantage, income inequality. And elsewhere in this paper, it's not exactly in the screen grab, you might have descriptive information on the data. So maybe you'd say out of the women that were aged 15 to 49, the average age was 24.5 years old or something like that. The next section is the results. So these give you the reports of the findings from the analysis that is in the current study. Now, results are going to depend on the type of data. So when you're looking at a quantitative paper, your results are numeric. And when you're looking at a more qualitative paper, your results are qualitative. So it would be more like long written paragraphs describing themes in a qualitative report versus statistics summarizing the data from a quantitative report. I always emphasize to essentially look up things you do not understand. And I think what's one of the most important takeaways I think of when it comes to reading is that reading is essentially learning how to learn. Um, the most important lesson I think everyone understands eventually in research is that you're never going to be the expert on all the things. Um, After, 10 years of me doing research, I'm not an expert on most things at all. I'm definitely not an expert on all the things. But what I am able to do is I am able to read and have me learn more information as the years go on. And that includes, frankly, Googling things I don't understand. If I see a statistic such as a type of, let's say, an odds ratio, and I don't know what an odds ratio is, I'll just simply Google what an odds ratio is and look it up or look it up in like a statistics textbook. The important thing is not to be overly intimidated by things you don't know, because that's the whole purpose of reading is you're learning and trying to understand things that you don't know. So the discussion is where we take an interpretation and make meaning of the findings. So findings are introduced in the results section and described in detail in the results, and the discussion is where you're making sense of it all. We really importantly need to connect the findings in the study to the previously described literature that you discussed in that literature review or the introduction. And there should always be some discussion of limitations. There's no such thing as a perfect study. There's no such thing as a perfect manuscript. There should always be some discussion of the limitations to that research or the interpretation of the data or something of that nature in the discussion section. Discussion sections should also generally include some sort of implications, whether that's new avenues for future research to explore, a new practice for a healthcare sort of setting to take up, a policy that should be implemented, or some sort of intervention. Um, Ideally, this, as going back to what we talked about at the beginning of this workshop, we read so we can add back knowledge into that system, that knowledge system, so that we can move research forward or have some kind of real world impact. So now that I've kind of went through, I think, demystifying a little bit of the kind of anatomy of a research paper, I just want to stress some general tips on things to do and not do. At least based on my experience. This is mostly, admittedly, some personal opinions, but I will explain them all. um, so, like I said before, Google the things you don't understand. It does not have to necessarily be Google. Ideally, it's more looking into textbooks. It's more doing readings on other things, but it's essentially look into the things that you're not fully understanding. Avoid getting stuck on trying to understand small details. The purpose is not to understand um, a particular single kind of small finding as much as you want to understand the whole takeaway of the study. Now those small details can be very important, and maybe that's where you put them down in notes or something like that. Um, but it's more important that you are having a broader understanding than getting stuck on small details. Because I think when you get stuck on small details, it's easier to start to spin your wheels and to get a little frustrated or overwhelmed. Try to critically evaluate the paper as you read. So, as I said, no paper is absolutely perfect. Most papers are far from perfect. Um, don't take what is written at just face value. And so, by critically evaluate, I want you to question things as you read. Why do you think the researchers did what they did in that study? Ideally, that should be transparent. A good paper doesn't leave you guessing too much. A good paper should be very transparent in their processes and their theories or their reasons why they're doing what they're doing. So particularly papers that are difficult to assess why they did or what they did, try to scrutinize and be critical of what you're reading. Do definitely take notes on important takeaways, on questions, on things that surprise you, on the things that you don't understand. Don't multitask while reading. So, reading, especially I know when we're in undergraduate and graduate school, we have a lot of readings. Every class is wanting us to read a chapter a week or multiple papers a week. Um, that's hard to frankly keep up with, and I understand that. And so I think instead of trying to cram a lot of stuff in or multitask, think about reading as really valuable time where you're going to be way more effective if you read a little slower and you actually take notes on things. Um, if you're reading a little bit more intentionally and taking notes, then you're actually digesting the information more. There's actually psychological research that finds that when you handwrite notes, you're digesting the information more and it tends to stick with you, especially if you are handwriting notes as opposed to just highlighting or typing notes, although I believe typing is better than just highlighting. Um, the purpose of reading in this way is to actively try to engage with the information and not passively try to engage with the information because active engagement is what's gonna make it stick and become more useful for you. A few more of do's and don'ts. Find the format that works best for you. Now, some people think reading on a hard copy paper, like printing your articles, having a hard copy book works better. Some people like to use reference managers and use online reading a lot. I think the important thing is not to force yourself to work in a way that just isn't working for you. So I personally don't read most things on a hard copy. I used to like that, but frankly, I got into my career more and I was reading so much, I was losing track of my papers and my notes and which paper had this important insight. One thing I'll do at the end of this is show you a little bit of what my reference manager looks like, and that's where I organize all my papers and my notes. So it's all on my laptop. The important thing is that you're working in some way that's going to be most conducive for you to read. Do look at the references and read relevant papers that they have cited. Do not assume that all references are correctly referencing the information that they say they are. I will say from experience, I have had papers that I have published. Somebody read them and cited them, but they cited it completely incorrectly. Like they said something about the paper that just wasn't in the paper. And that happens way more often than we want it to. So if you're reading an article and it's citing something else and you think that other thing is important, you should go read that other thing. Even if it's just to validate that it's saying the thing that was in the original paper. Usually that's a great way to do a literature review as well. So it's not a bad habit in general. Lastly, do read the paper. Now, I say this, it sounds a little funny. This whole workshop is about reading papers, but the one thing I like to emphasize is it doesn't have to be linear. Some people like to skip around, frankly. They might read the abstract and then the intro and then the discussion, and then they might go back and read the methods and results. Um, I think the important thing is that you're working in a format that works for you. Don't only read the abstract. A lot of people think that, well, all the important information is in the abstract, so that's the only thing I really need to read. Unfortunately, that is also sometimes very misleading because there might be important details that they leave out of the abstract. And ultimately, an abstract is a 300 word or less summary of what is usually a 30-page or less paper. So there's frankly just only so much information you put in abstracts. The last few notes I want to emphasize that I've already touched on is this is all about learning how to learn. We never enter these undergraduate or graduate or postdoctoral programs knowing all the things. We never start our careers knowing all the things. The important thing about reading is that you learn how to learn. And so we become researchers and lifelong learners. Pacing yourself is so important. It goes back to that working in a way that works for you. Sometimes I do reading early in the morning and I don't read all the things. I can only read so much. So even if it's only I read 2 articles in an hour, if I do that every day, I'm making way more progress than if I burnt myself out on the first day and then didn't read for a week. Staying organized is so important. Whether you like hard copy or online only, keep yourself organized. I'll show you my reference manager, like I said, at the end, so you could see a little demonstration of Zotero. Lastly, pay attention to the publication dates and generally read more recent work. But this is something that should be attenuated a little bit. And I say that because sometimes um, it is important to read the older work, especially if it's like a very foundational theory, if it has something that is still being impacting research or practice or policy today. It's really important to read that stuff too. But the more recent work, at least maybe generally in the last 10 or so years, is where you're going to see the more recent developments on the theory, the more new criticisms of it. And so sometimes what I do when I'm reading is if I, let's say I did a bunch of searching on Google Scholar and I found 5 articles to read, I'll read with the oldest publication first and work my way up to the more recent work. Sometimes that alone will tell you a story about how that idea has been changing over the years. And that could be really insightful itself. And then the last thing to note is that and this might have to do a little bit more when you're reading for the sake of a literature review, but it's really important to see not just the citations in that paper, like what did that paper cite, but who has cited this paper since it was published. That could be another really important way to look at the progression of ideas, and to look at other people's criticisms or how they've made sense of the work. I think that's about it. I know this was a little fast and it was a lot of information. But what I'd like to do is just stop for a second so we could take questions. Anything you are still thinking about. And as like I promised before, we can definitely look at some reference manager stuff.
Thank you for doing this.
For sure. Um, I know it sounds like it's a lot of information for a topic on how to read. Like we've all been reading generally for a long time. Whether you're at different stages of your research career, we're all read a little bit, right? But it's actually a skill. And as we discussed at the beginning of this workshop, it could be very overwhelming. So it's definitely worth trying to think about ways to make it less overwhelming and more doable.
Andrea, can you go over a bit the reference manager stuff? I think it'd be neat to see how you go through and use that.
Yeah, of course. Let me actually pull it up really quickly. And I'll share my screen. And it is admittedly, I was just talking about being organized, but it is admittedly not the most organized reference manager. However, it works is as it needs to, and that is the important part that I will show you. Um, so I'm going to open also a blank document and then I'll share my screen. Here we go. Okay. So this is what Zotero looks like on a desktop. It's essentially a software. You can use it on a web browser or the desktop. I personally really like the desktop. And each one of these is an article. So I have many articles, as you could see. And when you click on one, um, I'll click on one that actually has a PDF. You can see that it opens the PDF right there. I have all my highlights. I have my notes. I have over here, if I click right here, I had a note that I took, but barely par. I'm not very making a lot of sense with that note, but the important part is that you can add notes right into your reference manager. Um, and what's also particularly nice is when you're writing, let's say I'm writing something about youth violence prevention is important. And I want to cite that. If you have an extension on Word, you just add it to your Word essentially, where you can just import citations um, without having to type them out. So the way you do that, add edit citation. The first thing it'll ask you is what type of citation style. So I'll use the APA 7th edition. And then there it is, because it's an open document, they've already pulled it up for me. When I hit enter, it just pops up. And then while that I am done writing and I want to compile my references, mm, all I do is go to this button, add edit bibliography, click it. There it is. And as long as the Zotero has all the correct information input here, and if it doesn't, you could edit it, it's editable. It will pop it all in here with the most up-to-date reference style. So since I selected APA 7th edition, this is the APA 7th edition for it. And then let's say youth organizing is important. We need, it's my second sentence. I'm going to add another one to it. It automatically updates in the references as well. So this, like I said, is not just helpful because you can read and organize your notes, but it's also helpful for the writing process. I really recommend it. And there's other ones. This is the one I use specifically is Zotero, but there's all sorts of different reference managers out there. EndNote is another one that I think is provided for free through the university. You just have to access it through the library, I believe, to download the software. I'm using EndNote just because that's the one I was using in grad school, frankly, and it has a huge amount of articles in it. Um, but yeah, that's it. Any other thoughts or questions or things I could show you all?
Andrea, do you
Awesome
see the chat?
question.
Okay, great.
I did just see the chat. So is it possible or is it enough to do a literature review by only reading the abstract? My answer is frankly no. And I say that because if you are doing a literature review where let's say you're writing a section of a paper for a lit review. I think even if it's only, just, you know, you're looking at this one paper, I would still read the whole thing. And that's because so much information gets left out of abstracts. Sometimes information gets left out of abstracts that might change your whole opinion on the paper. Um, so for example, one of the things I do research on is policing. And I came across this paper that was looking at the public safety benefits of facial recognition programs. And to do this, they were looking at data and whether or not crimes were being reduced after the implementation of facial recognition. But the facial recognition data had a lot of missingness. This is not something that was in the abstract, but they had to impute like 90% of the missing data. It was a huge number that made me kind of really question other aspects about their methodology. If I only read the abstract, I would have never noticed that detail. Reading the whole paper, because in my mind, if you're imputing 90% of your data, I have a lot of questions about how you're imputing. I have questions about the conclusions you're making on that study analysis. So if you don't tell me that, and I don't know it, and I just say, well, this paper found that facial recognition prevents crime, but I didn't really think through more of the methods and criticize the methods, I'm actually missing tons of information. So I know sometimes it's like, oh, but I'm only writing a lit review. What I just need the main finding. I still encourage you to try to read the whole thing, even if you're reading non-linearly. Like I said, you might start with the abstract, jump to the discussion, then read the methods. Um, the important part is to absorb the information, I think. So however that's most conducive. For sure. Thanks for your question. Also, if anyone ever has questions in the future, wants to connect for any reason, I'm pretty approachable. I'm going to put my email in the chat. Or if you want like my slides or something, super happy to share the slides. Yeah, for sure.
Thank
Um,
you. And hopefully
yeah,
I will organize, I did record in time. So hopefully I will have this organized and we'll be able to share the recording as well.
great. Sounds good.
Juliet, quick question. Are we gonna send the evaluation link to folks after the session, or do we have that now?
If you give me, I might send it after, just for time purposes. Thank you for a reminder.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much, Andrea, for this super helpful training. As a reminder to folks, we have 2 more sessions in the series. So please come to those if you haven't registered for them already. We'll be sure to send out the recording, the PowerPoint, and the evaluation as well. We would love your feedback. And we'll be doing more of these types of sessions next semester too, and they're not super planned out yet. So if you have any other topics that you're interested in, we'd love to hear that as well. We'd love to bring whatever topics make the most sense for y'all to you guys this semester, next semester. So thank you so much for joining today, and we will see you. I believe the next one is September.